network advertising with networks in Redlands and Yucaipa. Call 909.
Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're back for the people. Why is the show called For the People, Gary?
Why?
Why?
Because it's for the people.
It's
for the people of Earth. Yes. We're on planet Earth, right?
You were talking about aliens last week. I thought maybe you needed to talk to somebody about
Well,
that.
I mean, Shape of Water won the best picture. So, yeah, there's aliens that roam. They win the best picture.
He looked a little like you, actually.
Well, thank you. I
in the
appreciate
tank.
it. A little blue, huh? I'm looking a little blue today.
I said, that guy looks familiar.
Thank you, Judge.
Today we're going to have a very exciting show, I think.
We do. Oh, my God. We have some special guests.
We have two very special guests here today. Number one is Sheriff Lee Baca, who's right here to my right. And to my left is Bob Lindsay, who is running for sheriff, who is a commander in the sheriff's department. And we're going to talk about gun violence, since it's a very popular subject right now. What can we do about it? So Bob and I have had a couple minutes to talk, and we recognize that these are governmental issues. So let me start off, because some of the folks have not heard some prior shows where we talked about what it takes to get a restraining order. And I had been sitting in that court for over about a 6-year period. So I thought we'd start off by talking about what it takes to get a restraining order. Now, there's a difference between a regular civil restraining order, which is quasi-criminal, and domestic violence cases that are heard in the family court. And what's really interesting, I always wondered why, is that the burden of proof is different. In order to get a civil restraining order, you have to prove by called clear and convincing evidence, which is a higher burden of proof than a civil matter, which is preponderance of the evidence, more likely than not. And it's less than the criminal standard, which is beyond a reasonable doubt to a moral certainty. And so it's a requirement that you prove beyond this standard in order to get a restraining order. Domestic violence is different. Most of the rules are the same, except they deal with relationships and they deal with children, child custody, and other issues which are not done in civil harassment. But the burden of proof in a domestic violence case is by a preponderance of the evidence, so it's less. It's easier to get a restraining order, believe it, in domestic violence cases than it is in civil harassment. Really is different.
Wow.
The ramifications are pretty much the same, one of which is to take guns away from people who shouldn't have them. And that was what I
Well, I don't own one. I don't own one, Judge, so don't worry about it.
I don't know if you're considered a threat. To some people, maybe.
No.
I don't see you as a threat, Gary.
Thank you.
I see you every week.
Well, I'm not a threat.
You haven't pulled a gun on me yet.
It's because he doesn't have one.
That's right.
That's what he's telling us. He doesn't have one. And what was that shotgun they had in your car? Oh, no, that wasn't you.
Oh, no, I don't have one.
Well, let me just go over very briefly how the system works, and then we're going to talk to our guests. The reality is it starts off with something called the request for a temporary restraining order. A temporary restraining order is filled on the same form, actually, and now I'm talking about civil harassment cases, which are quasi-criminal in nature. The application is filled out by one party called a petitioner. The petitioner comes in and makes all these allegations and statements about how bad the other side is. We don't know how true it is, but we don't take any testimony. We don't even see the people. We actually decide whether or not to grant a temporary restraining order in chambers. So you don't know how true the story is. And some of my colleagues, I used to talk to them about it. I said, you signing all these TROs, it has a permanent effect on your life when you put that on somebody's record. We're going to talk with Bob about that in a minute. The reality is those temporary restraining orders have the same force and effect as anything else. It means you got to turn the guns over. And I told the story, I think probably 2 or 3 times by now, of what caused me to get into the thinking that I came up with about suggestion, which we're going to talk about today too, is I had a lady come in and she showed me in her telephone, she'd gotten a text or an email from somebody, and there was the person sitting on the floor with a beer bottle in one hand and a gun in the other with a statement underneath. Well, you know I granted that one, but they're not all that clear. And so the temporary restraining order is only good for about 21 days, after which we have a hearing. And that's pretty much the same as any case. We take testimony from both sides. Hearsay is admissible, believe it or not, and we've talked about that in prior shows. Even though I've had discussions with some of my colleagues about that, the reality is hearsay is admissible evidence. So we consider police reports, we consider whatever we have, but they have a right to an attorney, each side. There is cross-examination, which makes it different than small claims court. It's an active proceeding with one side against the other. The party against whom the order is being sought is called a respondent. And we hold a complete hearing, and then we decide at the end whether or not the petitioner has met that burden of proof, whether it was by clear and convincing evidence. Now, the important thing to remember in restraining order cases generally is it has to be a continuing course of conduct. It can't be a one-time event, like somebody got beat up 3 months ago, and now they want a restraining order, but I haven't seen him in 3 months.
So I can kick somebody's ass and I won't get a restraining order against me?
You used that same example last week, Gary.
I'm just making sure, Judge.
Yeah, well, yeah. You could probably get away with that one.
Okay, cool. All right.
But some of them are pretty vocal. People are really angry, and they come in for revenge, and it can be very wild. You know, I always refer to it as Jerry Springer without the chairs, because that's what happens. Everybody's pointing fingers at the other and complaining about the other, but the effect of it is it's a public record. And we're going to talk to Bob, who's running for sheriff. We're going to talk to Bob about what effect it has when we sign an order. And so let's go, Bob.
Well, you've covered a whole football field here with the things that you've talked about. But when we talk about respondents and other folks that are involved in these civil cases, and you mentioned domestic violence, you mentioned the civil cases you're talking about, but what we didn't mention was the constitutional right to bear arms, right?
Well, I believe in the Second Amendment. It was never an issue of taking guns away from people who have a legitimate right to have them. The question is, what kind of people should be allowed to have them if they've exhibited a conduct which presents a clear and threatening potential of violence?
And that's the million-dollar question. Yeah,
and that's why we look. We're not psychiatrists. We're not psychologists, but certainly we can get a good sense when somebody's a little off the wall when we hear the testimony from various people. They bend up, no pun intended, shooting themselves in the foot most of the time, because they're there for their motivation is such that it's exhibited in the sense of potential future viability, of volatility.
Right, and the judicial system is a very important part of what we have to take a look at. So we talked out there and we said all judges aren't created equal. So there needs to be a very, very important and defining reason to go ahead and take somebody's gun away. Now, when you find that reason, what we have to do is we have to find the methodology to do that. Remember we talked about when you put a civil order out there?
Well, let me go back a second, because after I had this case with the lady with the beer bottle, I said to myself, you know, we already have a mechanism in place to control who has these guns, and it's called restraining orders. In fact, I noticed that Senator Rubio mentioned it the other day either in a press conference or in some release. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, what if we set up a national database of all restraining orders, because they are public record. You set up a national database, and anybody selling a gun has to go on that database to see if there's a name on there they shouldn't sell a gun to. And if they see that name on it, not only do they not sell the gun or the ammunition, because ammunition is a very important element, they have to notify law enforcement. They have to tell them, look, this guy or gal is on our list, and they're looking to buy a gun. Well, the order that we sign says you cannot own or acquire. So if that's the case, if they sell it and that person commits a crime, there's a concept in the law known as the felony murder rule. It means that they are equally responsible both civilly and criminally, and we're going to talk about it right after the break.
That's right. It's For the People with Judge Herb Dodell. We're here with Lee Baca, Sheriff Bob Lindsay, and Judge Herb Dodell.
10:50 a.m. KCAA.
Herb Dodell is a lawyer and a judge for the people.
Having served as a Superior Court judge, presiding over more than 9,000 cases, he has witnessed firsthand how complicated and corrupt the legal system can be. His goal is to show how things really work in the legal system so that people can navigate the legal system in the best way for them. Many people often feel marginalized by the legal system and are uninformed about how to proceed when unfortunate circumstances arise in their life. Judge Herb will pull back the curtain, lift the veil so people can truly understand their rights, have access to top legal personnel that they can trust, and have knowledge about how things work so they can make better choices. Judge Herb isn't just knowledgeable. His integrity and spiritual values are truly what make him different. He cares about democratizing access and information for all and desires to turn on the light so the people, you, can benefit. For more information, email the judge at askjudgeherb@gmail.com. That's askjudgeherb@gmail.com.
All right, welcome back. We're here today with Bob Lindsay, who's running for Sheriff of Los Angeles County, very qualified man. And to my right is Sheriff Lee Baca, former Sheriff of Los Angeles County, and we're talking about gun violence. It's a very hot subject. It's too bad it came about as a result of what happened in Florida a couple of weeks ago, but that's a wake-up call for us. And people always ask me, do I think anything is going to change because of what happened in Parkland? I think it's going to change because the kids are in it now. And they're vocal and they're emphatic and they have a real message. So talking about getting restraining orders, let's say we issue them. And by the way, we're supposed to turn over those orders the same day that we grant them. It's in our rules. And so it goes to the Sheriff's Department, and you're a former commander in the Sheriff's Department. What do you do with it when you got that order?
You know what, those civil orders are going to be entered, but here's the thing, that the Sheriff's Department doesn't go out and enforce civil orders. So if you do a civil order, let's say somebody does not return the guns in the situation you're talking about or turn them in for safekeeping, then we're not going to go out and look for those guns until there's a body attachment on a civil order, because we don't enforce civil orders.
Which I was saying to you, I think, before, I've never had anybody come in, even though when I was a deputy DA, the sheriffs and the officers would come in, tell us what the cases were about so we could decide whether or not we wanted to file a complaint. Nobody has ever come and asked me to sign a body attachment that I can ever remember. And I've heard hundreds of these cases over, almost now 10 years. So what do? You don't do anything? You just let it sit there? You serve them, of course.
Well, it's going to be in the system. If we happen to get a call there or something and we find out that there's a civil order, and we'll probably get a domestic violence call there or whatever it is. You're talking about maybe cases, civil cases wherein it's a business against another business. Those are a little bit different.
Well, I've also had cases where attempted murder, rape, child molestation, and they come in for a restraining order in the meantime, and I always say to them, why are you here now? Well, they don't know what's going to happen to that prisoner, how long it's going to be, when they're going to get out, or anything like that. So it's an interim relief for people under those circumstances. So those are pretty serious cases. It's not only the neighbors fighting with the neighbors or the boyfriends and the girlfriends. There are some very serious matters that end up, and those people are really dangerous.
Well, now you're talking about criminal cases, so you're not just straight civil. So when you go into the criminal cases, we're going to go get those guns, and we need to get those guns. But you were talking about a national database, too.
Yeah, I was.
So let's talk about the national database for just a second. National databases are wonderful if the information going in is correct and the information comes out when it's supposed to in a timely manner. And historically, that's been the difficulty. When you try and put something in, it has to be correct. Now, let's take, for instance, the domestic violence situations. How many of us know people who have gone in and lied about that?
Often.
They often lie about it. And why? They want to cause harm to the other person or the other party. And so when we start overreacting and taking things that we shouldn't take, this is when everybody gets at odds. So we have to make sure that when we're taking it something for appropriate reasons. Now, I'm not saying judges aren't appropriate. I'm not saying you don't rule correctly. But what I'm saying is, and there's one step beyond the taking, and that's the giving back of the guns. I have heard so many complaints of recent that when it comes time to give back the guns have already been destroyed, or they can't get them back. And this is after people have been proven innocent. So these are the things we have to take a look at on both sides of the spectrum. But more so, we have to keep people safe. We know that. The Parkland shooting is a perfect example. And I think if you go back to all these shootings, you're going to find out that most of these people involved in that were on antidepressants. So that gets into a whole different set of circumstances about how we track people, what we do with people, and which people should have or not have weapons.
Tell the folks a little bit what the CLETS system is. CLETS.
Well, it's a system wherein you go ahead and you place people into that system, and you're able to go ahead and run them for violations, for warrants, for things like that. And so when you submit what you're giving out of your courtroom, you're expecting us, the Sheriff's Department in this case, because we no longer have the Marshal's Department. The Sheriff's Department absorbed that under Libanca. But those are entered into those systems so that we can go ahead then, and law enforcement in California can go ahead and find, as law enforcement agencies throughout the state, they can find what is in that system and enforce it.
You think it's effective?
Well, I think it needs to be updated better. I think there's a lot of things that could be more effective. It's the most effective tool we have right now.
What would you do if you were the sheriff, in terms of putting you on the spot, Bob? What would you do in order to perhaps make this a little bit more workable so that we can monitor better the people that have an order against them and maybe violating that order?
Yeah, I think there needs to be a comprehensive system that we put together, and that would include what you're talking about, looking at a photo with somebody holding a beer and a gun. I mean, was that staged? How did that come up? What was she doing? Was she drunk at the time? I don't know. See, just from one photo. But when we have a comprehensive system wherein we can pull somebody in and we talk about judges, we talk about the evidence, you talk about preponderance of or the reasonableness of what you can use, and hearsay. You were saying you can use hearsay. Well, I wish in a lot of cases we could use hearsay, because a lot of the hearsay information we get is really good information. But in some cases, you can't use hearsay. So I think all of this information needs to be collected, and there needs to be a true global analysis of what's taking place. Because to take somebody's constitutional right away is a heavy burden.
Well, it's always a balancing act for us on almost everything. What do you think, Lee?
Well, I think what we have here is a reality that human beings are emotional. Emotional human beings who go over the top are violent at times. And the concept of how do you prevent all this is predicated on what kinds of things occur prior to the actual violation of the law and the so-called aggression that goes on in domestic violence and the like. So my belief is that the American public has to go into a different threshold when it comes to how they manage their own lives. And it's a broader solution, but it has to be brought into the equation.
What do you think about the idea that if somebody sells a gun to somebody on a database, that they would share civil and criminal liability in the event that something happens caused by that person who shouldn't have had a gun to begin with?
Well, databases are impersonal, as you know, and the question of gun ownership should always be predicated on an individual, name, address, all the things that go into the purchase process, and therefore the accountability will occur in that regard. We have a big problem with guns being stolen out of homes, marketed out of California because we have the strictest gun laws along with New York than any other states in the United States. Those are the top states. And I don't think that we're in a position to literally manage weapons properly in the United States. They do require a sense of what happens when it's lost or stolen. And a lot of people, when one gets either given, it's reported as stolen, and yet it was given to an individual who was an active gang member. They end up, we did studies with the the federal government. They end up in the East Coast, the West Coast, other states, and they're all California-bought guns.
So part of it is about monitoring it, and part of accumulating information, sufficient information to make a value judgment.
The person that reports a gun stolen should be in a registry, a national registry. So when the gun is found, it's tied back to that individual in some fashion. Now, if that individual gave up that gun and gave it to somebody, that's a crime.
That's the equivalent to the felony murder rule.
Correct.
Basically. But the question really is a question of due process. The use of restraining orders, allowing a party to have their day in court with their own lawyers, with the rights of an appeal, with cross-examination, with the availability of hearsay evidence, even though one judge and I have been fighting over this for years. She says she doesn't accept it at all. And I said, but we have a case that says you're supposed to. But we can take hearsay evidence, since you also mentioned it, Bob. You can take hearsay evidence. All you have to do is give it the weight to which you think it's entitled. You let it in, but you don't consider it. I've had a number of cases where people have made statements that were very helpful in analyzing the testimony that came out in court. Inconsistencies, for example. And the general rule against hearsay is based on untrustworthiness. Well, nobody's really saying that the police reports are untrustworthy. They should be given some relevance and some consideration as part of the overall analysis of the facts. And so if we have the ability to use restraining orders, and that's my pitch, if we could use restraining orders to keep track of who's got an interest in buying a gun who shouldn't have one, that sends the red flag up. That person is now on the radar. If they weren't on the radar before, they're on the radar now. And maybe this guy in Florida wouldn't have gotten a gun someplace. He had a restraining order against him, I understand, and nothing ever happened. And once we do this, the other issues, of course, deal with the record. This is a permanent record, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my heart goes out to the people in Parkland, obviously, and it spreads out beyond just the victims to everybody else, every school, where people are now afraid to go to school at a lot of places. But when you talk about that particular individual, you're right. The ball was dropped on that many, many times. And, you know, when we hear that what happened to the laws, well, out there, the laws weren't enforced. I mean, when you have somebody place on a computer the fact that they want to be a professional school shooter, that's a threat that he's going to be a professional school shooter. And right from that point, the police had been to his place 40 times, or at least 40 contacts. That's a lot of contacts. I don't know too many people out there, you know, if you're not a gangbanger or something like that, that get 40 legitimate police contacts that are captured. Those are captured contacts.
Well,
So what's that mean?
Well, let me add to that. You know, the idea that this was not unknown is false. It was known. Every level of government, federal, state, and local, knew about this particular individual and did not intercede. That's what you're alluding to. You have to have a registry. You have to have something that is accountable in terms of a consistent tool.
Well, if he had gone in to try to buy a gun at a regular gun store, put aside for the moment the gun shows, and somebody saw his name on there because somebody had gotten a restraining order against him, whether it was his family or his friends or the teachers at school or whoever, they would have said, wait a minute, this guy shouldn't have a gun. That phone call would have gone out to law enforcement to at least investigate this guy or talk to this guy or put him on some let's watch this guy list. That didn't happen. But if we follow this plan, it's only a plan. If we follow this plan, now you know this guy exists or this gal exists, and you can monitor and do whatever the law allows you to do to keep at least an eye on that person. That wasn't done here, and it could be done if we were more vigilant in terms of keeping track of who these people are. Those people shouldn't have guns.
Well, there's another parallel dilemma. Child molestation is another one of those kind of things where the molester should be in a registry, and it was in all sheriff stations and police stations.
Isn't it? They do keep track of that, don't they?
Yes, indeed. But this is what you're pleading for.
Yeah, I am. I think it's basically the same thing. I mean, you talk about issuing warrants. You know, the federal government has this special judge that issues these warrants and things. They're making decisions as to whether there's sufficient probable cause to do it. I'm using the legal term probable cause, and the same thing really should exist within the gun community. And when I met in Washington, I met with a U.S. senator, to talk about this. We were old friends. And he says, Herb, be realistic. The NRA is never going to let anything like this ever get onto the books of the law as long as you're alive. I said, no, I'm not so sure about that. He said, it's the lobby will keep it out. It ain't going to happen. But now, if you've got a disinterested judge, a neutral, making these decisions after giving complete due process, cross-examination, inquiries, and they have lawyers, you know. The lawyers can do a good cross-examination. The burden of proof is heavy. Continuing nature is necessary. All of those things. We've gone one step closer to controlling who has these guns, who shouldn't have them. And we'll talk about that right after the break.
It is For the People with Judge Herb Dodell. We have Sheriff Bob Lindsay and Sheriff Lee Baca in studio.
NBC Talk Radio, 1050 AM, KCAA.
In his book, From the Trench to the Bench, Judge Herb Dodell demystifies the legal system, including both civil and criminal, the lawyers, the judges, and the process. As a judge, former deputy district attorney, and criminal defense attorney, he knows the legal system. He has the inside information that you need to pick a lawyer, and he's here to give it to you. No matter what you're facing that makes you think you may need a lawyer, Judge Herb will shed valuable light on your situation and reveal your best options and many secrets of how the judicial system actually works. To find out more about how the legal system really works, you can get your copy of Judge Herb Dodell's eye-opening book, From the Trench to the Bench, at Amazon.com.
Okay, we're back with our two very interesting guests. I'm thrilled, actually. I'm actually surprised to see Sheriff Baca here today. This was a surprise. I knew we were going to be talking about Bob Lindsay because we had arranged for it, but I didn't expect this guy to show up. And I hadn't seen Lee in probably, 3-4 years?
3 or 4 years, yes, sir.
And it's interesting that if we could get law enforcement together with the community on this very common issue, we really could do a lot more from an administrative standpoint. We can talk about what the law is about. We can talk about what the judges do. We can talk about all of those things till the cows come home. But if nothing ever happens after we sign the order, other than it reposes in some database someplace, we're not doing the job. We need to do better. So we're talking to a guy who's going to do better.
Absolutely.
After our conversation last week, I said to myself, this is the guy we should be talking to. He should be the sheriff.
Well, look it. I got the bumper sticker right here in the studio.
That's how I knew who he was.
Yeah, there you go. I need to put my face on that then.
Okay.
Maybe not. Maybe not. It jumps out. It says, vote Bob Lindsay.
That's right.
And I'm going to.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that.
So am I.
But I need
go to
your
the
family. I need your family, too.
You'll get all 5 of us. No problem. If you did nothing today, you got 5 votes.
6 with me.
We have people actually who do listen to this show. Actually, I know one because I'm going to talk about her particular problem next week.
Okay.
And she heard the show and something came up, and a law enforcement issue, and I'm going to do that.
Can I just say one thing about Sheriff Bob Lindsay? He is very, I love his vibe, his energy, his thought process. He's open to a lot of different things and a lot of different issues. I don't want to really get into it, and it's your show, but I've had him on my show, and he's a very progressive sheriff. He's going to be a very progressive sheriff, and he's not going to buy belt buckles and change the decals on the police cars and cost about $1 million. I just want to throw that in there.
You got that? And no, I'm not going to do that.
I know you're not.
You're
gonna
running
do
on that platform, right?
No.
No change to the license plate.
Opposite the belt buckles and the stickers.
But he's a very progressive person, and he's going to be a great sheriff.
Thank
Well,
you.
we have a great sheriff's department now.
Yes,
but
we
it
do.
could be better. I don't think it's a fault of anybody. It's the fact is it's a governmental run agency with a lot of limitations, political limitations, financial limitations. All of those things come into play. You can't help that.
Well, the leadership can help that. I'm going to tell you right now, we do have the finest deputy sheriffs in the country, and I'm proud of all of them.
As the largest sheriff's department in the nation, as well as the world.
Well, you can
Now
tell.
you're surrounded.
But I was involved in law enforcement long ago, so I'm kind of used to it. But tell us in a short version of what you think you could do as the new sheriff.
Look, we need to get everybody sitting down because everybody, I believe, this is my personal belief, wants the same thing. We don't want crazies running around with guns. This is the last thing I want as a police officer. This is the last thing the community wants. And to be honest with you, I think it's the last thing that gun owners in the NRA want. So we have to think or find a viable solution. And it's like you're saying, a database. But that database has to be right. You know, it's like the no-fly list, right? Remember the no-fly list? Still
Yeah.
out there, right? Lots of people are on that no-fly list. You get on the no-fly list and you're the wrong person on the no-fly list, they don't know how to get you off the no-fly list. So you just don't fly. And these are the things that people are concerned about. They're concerned about a name going into into a category that can't be removed and that shouldn't be there in the first place. And these are the real big concerns. So if we could sit down, come up with viable solutions on knowing exactly what we're dealing with and strict rules about placing people on these lists, then I think you could get people across the table to shake hands.
Well, that's another issue, too, about language that gets on the record is there forever. People say, what do you mean it's forever? The restraining order is only good for 3 years. That may be so, and they may not be bound by anything, but that name is on that database forever. And there is no way of getting it off. It's different. In the criminal law, we have a provision for misdemeanors, actually for felonies as well, where you can reduce the charges and ultimately, after a period of time, the charges get dismissed.
Yes.
But not with restraining orders. They're there forever, whether you like it or not. In fact, you asked me, Gary, one time, if there's still a restraining order, is there still a record of you? Yes, there is.
Well,
probably.
What?
That's
What?
Is that a birth record?
No, man. I mean, it's a long story,
Yeah,
Sheriff.
we're not going to go into
it was me. I was going through.
and-
It was when I was going through my divorce with my wife. You know, and she accused me. I was in Laguna Beach, and she accused me. She lived in Simi, and she had just met some other dude, and she left me. And she accused me of being on her balcony when I was 90 miles away, and I had to go to Simi court. And you know, I actually had a receipt at the bar I was at in Laguna Beach. You know what I mean? I'm like, what are you talking about? I was in Laguna Beach for the weekend. And, you know, lo and behold, I had to go to court and was dismissed. But you're telling me that is on my record?
Even the TRO is on your record.
Jesus.
See, this is what we're
change.
talking about.
This is bull.
Yes, that's exactly right. We need to take leadership to make some of these changes to make it more fair for everybody. A person who had a TRO, when they never appeared, nobody ever represented them, the judge signed it in chambers, and that's still on their record? It could have been all wrong, and many times it is all wrong. You can't do a thing about it.
Can I see my ex-wife for the money I gave her on the divorce?
Maybe you don't want to see your ex-wife.
I don't, but I'm just saying if I can get some money out of her. I'm kidding.
But you know what? When you say that, even if it's tongue-in-cheek, a lot of people are in the litigation system for exactly that reason.
Yeah.
No merit. Either it's an ego-driven thing, such as revenge or hostility, or I got and you don't got, or whatever it is.
Well, that's what Sheriff Bob was
happens.
talking about. That's what he was talking about. These databases and these things that happen that you get on these things. Like I guess I'm on one. I didn't even know. I'm 100 miles away. I'm not even near her. And lo and behold, I had to go to court and defend myself. And the judge dismissed it because I showed him the receipt. And he's like, you know.
Well, that's the problem with ex parte in general. It's one-sided with nobody there to refute anything. And somebody says all these things about you. Some judge is reading him and saying, well, I don't know what I'm going to do here. I have to watch out for the protection of the people. On the other hand, I don't know how true or not. If I'm going to err, I'm going to err on the side of caution. In fact, I mentioned that to the commissioner up in Antelope Valley, I think it was, when I was doing these up there. And I said, what percentage of these ex-parties, these temporary restraining orders do you get? He says, almost all of them. I said, how could you do that? When you do that, you've put something on somebody's record that they're going to carry around and may have been no justification whatsoever. He says, but what if they all ended up doing something? I said, yeah, well, if you think that they're going to do something, that's a lot different than just reading somebody's comments about having a fight at the bar. And so that's something we should look at.
Well, it sounds to me like he's concerned about his liability and not the case itself.
Well, I know that may be true, too.
Yeah.
You know, judges are not immune from that, nor is anybody else. We're always watching out for our own interests, always. Sometimes we're not really objective about it, which makes it even more difficult.
Look, you know, I think the primary thing that we need to look at, and I'm sure Sheriff Baca would concur with this, but he has his own opinion, is mental health. I mean, what does it take to go in and shoot, 17 school kids and a teacher? I mean, this is a mental health issue most of the time, and not the domestic violence and the other things that we're talking about when we're talking about school shootings. Now, there have been some. We know that. People who get angry with their wife who's a teacher, or they're mad at the principal and things like that. But most of the time when we talk about these school shootings, it's associated with, or there's a nexus to either depression or some sort of mental health condition.
What do you think we can do about that?
Well, those are the things that we have to pull together. The people, and people are starting to do that. But I mean, if you look at the LA County Jail now, it's full of mental health patients. They don't belong there. This is not where mental health patients belong. We need to find the resources, the money, the governmental money, whatever it is, to go ahead and put them in facilities where they can get the best treatment, not incarceration, treatment.
There was a show last night, I think it was on CNN. Was it CNN? Oh, 60 Minutes. They're talking about some new approaches to incarceration. A lot of these prisoners are now being treated a lot differently.
That was in Germany, too, by the way.
Germany, yeah. And that seemed to make sense to me. Treat them like people instead of treating them like, like cattle. It makes an enormous difference in their mental stat.
Well, we've got the mental health population taking over the jails so that we can't put criminals in the jails, so we leave the criminals out with the public.
That's not a good idea.
Well, that's what's happening.
Well, even Gary would agree with that. Right, Gary?
No comment. No, of course not. Of course not.
I try to make Gary a participant.
Leave me alone, Judge, today.
I'm on you today, Gary.
Go ahead.
Well, Gary's the pilot of the show here, but the point
is... It's his show, He keeps saying it's my show. It's his show.
Go ahead.
Well, no, the more important thing is that we have a society that is fragile. We have people who are fragile. We have laws that are somewhat restrictive but not effective in preventing things, and that the idea of intervention is a big part of the solution. Our jails, for example, had 3 charter high schools. Half the people in jail didn't finish high school, and therefore, if you don't have a job capability because you don't have a high school diploma, you're already going down the tubes. Now, this young man over in Parkland, he was already known by everybody. He had already shown his passion for weapons, and he had all this fantasy about what he was going to do, and he said, I'd like to be a professional hitman. And yet the authorities knew all this. Why do you need an order of any kind to go in there and investigate this guy right away? Common sense tells you go in there and take all his guns and sit him down and find out what the heck his problem is.
Well, that's the reason why the court can provide a reasonable variance to get this done, because now you have something that's official, so to speak. A disinterested, neutral third party can decide, Bob, some of those health care issues too.
Well, in some cases you don't even need that, though. When you have the statements that this young man made and you have evidence that he's capable of carrying this out, that rises to the level of the police getting involved.
Well, it could result in a mental health law enforcement agency, for crying out loud. That is nothing but other than that.
That's an interesting concept.
I like that.
I like that, too. And, we do it in civil law. In fact, we do it in criminal law, too. I think it's Department 95. It used to be Department 95, where if somebody has a mental issue, they can't consent for something, for example. I had it in settlements where I said, I'm not sure this person knows what's really going on here. And you send it out for an evaluation. We have a mandatory law in California that requires a person to submit to basically a hospitalization for at least, I think it's 72 hours for an evaluation. If it's justified and law enforcement thinks that this person needs to be evaluated, that's another step that we should be thinking about and expanding our efforts to control who's got the guns. Not gun control. I don't use that term very often, except when I make a mistake. But the bottom line is it's not about gun control. It's about people control.
Correct.
Well said.
And that's what
Well
we
said.
really need to do, is to just make sure that we're giving them right treatment to the people who need it. And some of that is health issues.
The sheriffs have to go, Judge.
Okay.
All right.
You
Great
have
show,
15
guys.
You have 15 more minutes so you can harass me.
Well, you're harassing me today, actually.
Probably
had to bring up the restraining
and it's
order on me
justified.
with the two sheriffs here. You had to bring up my restraining order.
You know-
Thank you, appreciate it. Thank you very much. Alleged.
First of all,
I'm okay.
before we get to the break, I want to thank Bob Lindsay and Lee Baca for coming today and
You're very
for
welcome,
putting in
Judge.
Thank you,
their
Judge.
3 cents in.
Hey,
It used to be 2 cents, but inflation has got up to 3 cents.
We got to get him back on the show again.
And you know, I'm not a political person. You know how many times I've said that. I'm not political, but I think Bob Lindsay's got great ideas, and
He does.
I think he's the right guy for the job.
Vote Sheriff Bob Lindsay.
And 5 of us in our house are going to do that.
Thank you,
There you
Judge.
go.
I appreciate it.
Okay. Thanks for coming by, guys.
Take care. God bless.
Thank you, Your Honor.
NBC Talk Radio, 1050 AM, KCAA.
Did you ever meet a lawyer that was for the people? Someone who had the best interests of the people at heart? Herb Dodell has been a lawyer for more than 50 years and has been a Superior Court judge for 9 years, having presided over more than 9,000 cases. In this show, he will reveal the secrets of how things really work in the legal system, so you can maximize your position and benefit most when you're in trouble and need someone on your side to simplify the process for you. For more information, email the judge at askjudgeherb@gmail.com. That's askjudgeherb@gmail.com.
All right, it is For the People with Judge Herb Dodell. You got to get his book, From the Trench to the Bench, available on Amazon.com. And also askjudgeherb@gmail.com if you got any questions. Judge,
Well, you know,
did I take care of my brother here? What?
well, you know what? I did get somebody contacted me not too long ago. We get a lot of contacts of people who have questions, you know.
Yes.
I don't give legal advice because I don't know enough about the cases and I'm not retained, so I don't do that. But had some very interesting comments and some questions, so I'm going to address them next week. The purpose of the show is, of course, to help the public navigate through the legal system, and knowing and having information about how to do that is very, very valuable. If somebody gives you a subject that you know nothing about, you're going to feel a little uncomfortable. But if you know what you reasonably could expect or what generally happens, you're better prepared. You're going to be less anxious. You're going to be less nervous, less fearful, more into certainty
Absolutely.
than being, what am I going to happen? What's going to happen to me kind of thing.
Yeah, that was a great show. It was great to have Sheriff Lee Baca. Wow.
I was surprised. I met Lee Baca a number of years ago.
Right.
We were working on a project together, actually, for some then clients, and they had a mutual interest. And I met him several times, actually. I found him to be a charming guy who really knew what he was doing. He had the right motivations. Whatever issues came up in his life, that was really not him. He's a really good guy.
He's a good dude.
So-
he did a great job with the sheriff's department, by the way. I mean, whatever happened, and with all the other legalese stuff. I mean, he was like one of the best sheriffs in the nation.
Yeah, he was pretty good. I liked him.
And he's actually endorsing Sheriff Bob Lindsay, and Bob is a very progressive sheriff. I mean, he is. I'm for the legalization of marijuana. Of course, it got legalized, but He's also for like
Was that the holiday for you?
No, but I mean,
Was that the day you could celebrate it?
He's actually working with that industry to make sure that it's not around schools, not around kids, that it's regulated properly, things like that. I mean, these are certain things. He's also talked about, how criminals just get kicked out, like they don't even do any jail time. They just go and they rather, instead of do like rehab or do a work furlough, they rather just go to jail.
Well, that's been a social issue for a long time. But I think that what Bob said about health issues, and Lisa, the same thing, that's really where we need to focus.
Yes.
A lot of these people who are doing these things have real health issues, mental health issues.
Absolutely.
And even as judges listening to them in restraining order court, you can pretty much tell when somebody's a little off the side. Really, you can. They say things, they do things, they look in a certain way. The body language tells you a lot about it. We need to develop new methodologies to treat the cause as opposed to the effect.
Well, Judge, there is no like mental health hospitals anymore. I mean, they basically did away with all of them, and now, like Sheriff Bob Lindsay said, they just put them into jail, and then they're there. There's a bunch of mental health issues there in jail, and then they just release them, and lo and behold, they just go out there and commit crimes and do whatever. There's no help for them.
Well, my concern has been the lack of follow-up. And Bob didn't say so, although he certainly could have. Part of it is about the money. They haven't got enough deputies to do all of this. When he told me that they don't go out and pick up on civil harassment cases when somebody's violating an order, that was a bit of a surprise to me, actually. I thought, well, you send the order over. We're supposed to do it the same day. They serve it. You would think that they know that the gun has to be turned over someplace, and they don't follow up on it.
Well, I mean, from what I understand, and I've had Sheriff Bob Lindsay on my show a couple times, he said that this McDonald guy, who's the acting sheriff now, spends money on really ridiculous things. Like I mentioned, the belt buckles, he changed them from like silver to gold, and then the decals on the sheriff's.
Oh, that's what you were talking about?
Yes.
I didn't know that.
Oh, yes. He changed the belt buckles. He thought people would be more resistant to committing crimes. And I mean, this is what Sheriff Bob Lindsay was telling me. I didn't know. And then the decals, he changed the lettering or something like that. He's spending thousands and thousands of dollars on that instead of helping out his deputies and the jail system and all this other stuff. Yes.
But I got to say that our sheriff's department is a pretty good sheriff's department.
Oh, they're great.
They are professionals. They're hardworking, honest people who really care about protecting the public. So in that regard, can't blame them.
No.
If they don't have enough people to go around to do the job, whose fault is that?
Yeah, exactly. He also said that the deputies are overworked, and they don't spend a lot of time at home because they're overworked, and there's just a lot of bad energy going there, and he wants to change that. That's what he wants to do. That's why he's running for sheriff of Los Angeles.
I'm going to make this into a political program because it's really not. But
Well,
I was
I'm just
interested
saying,
in the ideas.
I'm
No,
just
the
telling
ideas.
you. I'm just telling you. Listen, I'm voting for him. That's why I'm a backer of his, and I'm not saying it's a political program. I'm just stating that this is why he's a good candidate. That's all. That's all I'm stating. It's my own personal
When's the
opinion.
election, by the way?
I think it's June 6th.
Oh, it's a primary?
I believe so. He said it's June 6th. That's the first one. Or I don't know if I think it's just that's it. I think whoever wins June 6th wins it, but I'm not really positive.
I didn't know it was that imminent.
Yeah,
Really.
it's very close, but I'm just stating facts that he told me about the sheriff's department, that there's a lot of deputies are upset. That's all. They're very.
Or maybe somebody's in the belt buckle business. Or does cockamamie? Yeah, that's a word you haven't heard before, right?
Cockamamie, I don't
Cockamamie's.
know. I don't know.
They're changing the language, huh? It's no longer we're here to serve.
Yeah, who knows what they're doing? I don't know. But anyways, I'm just saying he's a very progressive candidate for sheriff, and I think he would do great work. And it was great to have Sheriff Lee Bach in here too. I mean, it's very fascinating. I was shocked to see him come in.
You were.
Absolutely.
You didn't know about this? Was not a surprise you were going to spring on us?
I swear to God, I had no clue, Judge. I thought I knew Sheriff Bob Lindsay, but then I was like, "Whoa, I didn't book
Well,
that."
you
I
know
would've
what?
told you.
We were sitting out in the lobby, and the elevator doors open, and there Baca walks out, saying, "Wow, that's kind of interesting. He must know somebody in the building." It was you.
Not me, you. He knew you. I've never met him before. Except for maybe at the LAPD celebrity golf tournament where I was harassing celebrities.
Oh,
while
that's
he was
right. You're a
playing
you're a scratch golfer, right?
I'm not a scratch. I'm good, but I'm not scratch. Not scratch, but I'm pretty good.
We're turning this into but that's okay. We had a serious show today.
It was a very serious show.
Some shows are not so serious. Next week we're going to talk about what happens if you get defrauded and you end up giving up something that you own because you got defrauded into doing it, and what can you do about getting it back?
And somebody actually sent you an email.
Yes,
on
they
this.
did.
Okay, cool. And listen, if you want to email the judge, he will answer your questions. If you can, and you actually responded to this person.
I did.
And you're actually gonna address the issue on next week's show.
I am.
That's awesome. And listen, it's askjudgeherb@gmail.com. That's ASKJUDGE@gmail. Oh, I forgot your name.
You forgot the way
I know it's gonna screw it up.
I know you were celebrating the legalization. I remember that.
Well, I partake today. No, I did not. I did not. I did have some sake though at lunch. I have to admit.
But you're a beer drinker. What is the?
Well, I went to my friend's sushi place in Tarzana, during my break here, and had a bottle of sake. Sorry. A
bottle of sake.
Well,
that sounds menacing.
It was nice. Listen, it was cool. I play golf with him every Wednesday, so it's a very good cushy.
Well, but the point I want to make for the listeners is that we try to mix up the shows. So some of them are just entertaining, some of them are informational, some of them are helpful to guide you through the system. Some of it is spiritual, hopefully. Some of it is just to provide you with information that you can use in your everyday life. And so we try to mix it up. I'm thinking about what we're going to do for the show after next week.
Okay.
Maybe we're going to talk about domestic violence.
All right.
Because that's a very prominent subject right now, and it's happening so frequently. It's getting more attention now than it ever got before.
And by the way, Sheriff Bob Lindsay made a valid point about how people, you get upset and you get into a big fight with somebody, like you're going through a divorce or a breakup. Somebody can accuse you of that, male or female.
Oh, yes,
you know what I mean? That can happen, and it's a very scary subject, man.
Well, I'm also thinking about, and in fact, I mentioned it to her last night, of having my wife on as a guest because she's a crisis counselor in domestic violence issues.
Oh, absolutely. You should
I
have
said,
her
you
on.
know more about this than I do.
Have her come
so
down.
I said, come on, let's do the show.
We've got a bunch of mics.
I don't want to do it. She says, I said, come on, you look great, you talk great, you're smart. Why don't you do it?
She'd be great on the show.
I will have to convince her.
Absolutely, you got to do it.
She talks on the phone to people who have issues.
Oh, really?
She's a crisis counselor.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome.
Yeah, well, she tells me the horrible things that are going on, and I tell her about the same horrible things that I see. I mean, the world is not built of roses right now.
No, it isn't.
We need to change the consciousness of the people, and we need to do that by making them aware of the problems that exist. You can't stick them under the rock anymore. You can't get away with the stuff that got away with for many, many, many years.
Yes.
And when I was in the showbiz, it was very common. We used to call it the casting couch.
Oh, I would love. We see it was Oscars yesterday. We should. I would love to hear some of these stories about some of these people you dealt with.
Oh, but you know what? The stories that you didn't hear are probably better than the stories you did hear.
That's what I'm talking about. You can tell us.
You're touching the tip of the iceberg.
I'm not touching any iceberg, especially not your tip.
That's right.
I'm not there's no tip I'm touching.
Here.
I'm not tipping no iceberg.
So anyway, next week we'll have an interesting show.
All right.
And the week after that. And
They're
the week
all
after
interesting.
That, yeah, well.
They're great. What are you talking about?
Write to me if you have any questions. I'm trying to answer.
What's your email again? I forgot.
You forgot the middle name.
Ask Judge Herb.
AskJudgeHerb@gmail.com. And the website, where you can hear these radio shows, by the way, is judgeherbdodell.us.
Judgeherbdodell.us. And askjudgeherb@gmail.com.
Right.
You can actually communicate with an acting judge. How many people can say that?
I'm
Come on.
acting all the time.
You are an actor. All right, we got to get out
I'm
of here.
becoming an actor.
I love you.
Well,
All right,
it's been a great show.
All right, take care.
See you next week.
All right.
KCAA Loma Linda, 1050 AM, 106.